The US and Chinese economy are linked no matter what anybody says. And we're seeing a big change here in US fiscal policy when it comes to tax cuts, especially the corporate rate, which of course affects China, but also lots of moves on trade, whether it's solar cells or steel and aluminum. How does that fit in for China's outlook going forward? This is sort of the elephant in the room going forward, isn't it?
Well, it's not the elephant in the room. It's the elephant's trunk is in the room, but most of the elephant's still outside.
But it's coming in or going out?
Well, that's the question.
Right, okay.
Because essentially when we're doing macro projections of the kind you're talking about, even bad, wasteful, stupid trade battles actually don't mean that much to growth.
They're
small in magnitude. They may be very important for particular businesses. They may be very important as a precedent and creating a climate that's negative. But they generally don't tend to have big macro effects. On the other hand, if the Trump administration were to go fully ahead with some of the extreme anti-China views that they have, then it's a very different matter. We've done some modeling at the Peterson Institute, and then you're talking about affecting literally millions of jobs on both sides of the Pacific. But
that's this tit for tat.
If you do more than
trade war,
right,
getting
towards serious trade war. So I mean, again, tit for tat is sort of normal. Like we have the stuff with the washing machines, which is mostly affecting South Korea, by the way, not China, as you know. But the steel, whatever. If the Chinese then say, okay, we're going to put tariffs on sorghum. You know, sorghum farmers in the U.S.
Soybeans,
but soy is a bit bigger. But, you know, this level of tit for tat is bad. It's wasteful, but it's not going to imperil anybody's growth. The big issue, which I would like to pick up on, which relates to some of the stuff you were talking about with your clients, is I think what's going to get much worse much more quickly is the climate for cross-border investment. So at the end,
we're already seeing that, aren't we?
We're already seeing that. There's a bill going through the Congress to expand the remit of CFIUS. It's written,
which stands for,
the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States.
Which sounds boring, but it's very important.
It's both boring and important. and so it is an interagency committee that reviews when foreign investors come to the U.S., and it's always been a bit arbitrary, but it had a relatively narrow remit that it was supposed to block things that affected U.S. national security. There's a new bill going through the Congress with a lot of support from both parties in the Senate that on paper is expanding significantly the remit of CFIUS, their ability to review all kinds of potential investments in the U.S.
From sort of semiconductors to...
No, to ham. I remember the Smithfield ham thing. I mean, it's going to be everything. Part of the bill is geographic. If they want to acquire something that's within a certain number of miles of a U.S. military base, let me just make this point. My colleague Gary Huffbauer estimates it's going to increase the caseload of CFIUS between 100 and 1,000-fold, which is insane, which basically means it shuts down foreign investment. And the real intent of this bill is meant to block technology transfer to China by blocking investment. And again, there's reasons to be very concerned about technology theft or copying in China, which needs to be dealt with at the EU, Japan, US together. But this is a terrible way to do it. And so we've come total 180 reversal from 2 years ago talking about a bilateral investment treaty to potentially a total shutdown of cross-border investment. And cross-border investment, even though it's very small, has enormous implications for the competitiveness of businesses, for supply chains, for reputation. Sorry.
And growth of new industries as well.
Absolutely.
As people, absolutely. That's a really good international outlook. Sitao, I just want to come back to the domestic situation in China, because there's a lot of domestic policies that perhaps our international audience don't always talk about, which will affect its economy in 2018. The other, one of them is the big poverty alleviation project, which is trying to bring the last tens of millions of people out of poverty in rural China. We've also got huge environmental actions going on. You've seen a turnaround, for example, in air quality in Beijing and other major cities. Is that a drag on growth going forward, Sitao?
I think on the environmental front is a drag, but I think that's the right price to be paid. On poverty reduction, I also think that's a correct policy. If you study recent economic history in Asia, for example, during Asian financial crisis, Indonesia, I do think you need to strike the balance between efficiency and fairness, and otherwise you may taste the bitter fruit of economic success. So actually, I think the policy on both environmental protection and poverty reduction are correct. But having said that, I do think China needs to open up more. And I think the market is waiting very anxiously from what Liu He has pledged at Davos.
Now, he was meant to, there's talk of him actually coming to DC in the next few days as well. In terms of what would boost Chinese growth in areas that you think China's receptive for, whereabouts, Sitao? What areas are you looking at?
Well, China can do many things. And for example, in so many areas, and the state-owned enterprises can withdraw. I mean, really, and in an ideal situation, state-owned enterprises would only operate in sectors which are providing social services. So there is a massive room for we call that mixed ownership experiment. The other thing people don't talk about that is the resident permit system. Imagine if we, I don't want to say demolishing a resident permit system, if we just significantly relax resident permit system, you would unleash tremendous economic activities in the economy.
Yes, in fact, sort of Singapore model like they did. I just want to go to Portland again. Yan, in terms of domestic problems and growth, there is overcapacity in some industries, especially legacy industries. We talk about steel, that's partly due to the oversupply on the world market and everything the Americans are complaining about. How can China rebalance its economy while also growing like this? Is there a risk of a hard landing? And we haven't even talked about property prices as well. So please address those.
Right. So this is sort of the $2 million question, right? So I would say that there are a lot of, like, the speaker talked about, there are a lot of promising areas. Just give one quick example. Education, childcare, a lot of different services industry. They are growing, and they have the promise to replace the manufacturing sector, especially, given this recent 2015 policy of, removal of the one-child policy. So we will see some sectors like this that, grow. And we also talked about, the state-owned enterprises reform. So the speaker mentioned about that, and that's correct. About 68.9% of the state-owned enterprises now have the mixed ownership type, and so they are, hopefully to, be able to improve efficiency and all of that. And plus, we have this homegrown sort of grassroots innovators, companies like Tencent, Alibaba, and
BAT,
a couple other ones, and right, and especially now, the whole sharing economy. So there are a lot of, bright spots that I think will help to sustain some growth. And at the same time, right, we also, see the growth of financial sector, which could be, double-edged sword. So I think, it will be, I think there is growth momentum, but it has to be managed carefully. And going back to the idea of, poverty reduction, and I think this is a great idea, not just because, you wanted to have more equality in the country for social and political stability, but also knowing that we still have a lot of population there in the rural area, have very low purchasing power. So poverty relief will help to strengthen, their income and their domestic demand. And that would be a great way to replace investment as a driving force, or export for that matter.
Thank you, Yan.
So I think this is a very good step, yes.
Yan, Adam, you want to pick up on something?
Well, I wanted to say a couple things about the state-owned enterprises, as many of the speakers have spoken about. I think there's two misconceptions here. First is that this is so unique to China. It's particularly bad in China in terms of wasted money. But, France has state-owned enterprises, the UK has state-owned enterprises, South Africa. The US is the extreme outlier, and even as an outlier, the US has a lot of quasi-state-owned things.
You mean like Boeing and GE?
Well, not GE, but Boeing. Okay. Boeing, you could argue, because of the huge defense contract.
Lockheed Martin, all these people.
Right. And so, we shouldn't get too caught up in this verb opening and this word state-owned enterprises. It's a lot more nuanced than that.
State-dependent?
Well, just to say that China is not unique in this. But the second point is, and this is a little bit on the debt issue, that to me and to my colleague Nick Lardy, who's one of the great China analysts in the US, our view is that the money going into the state-owned enterprises, this big chunk of the credit that you were talking about earlier, is being wasted on sort of the Korean-Japanese model. So in the Korea and Japan in the 80s and 90s, you had huge amounts of money going into the Keiretsu in Japan or the Chaebol in Korea. And
we're talking about Samsung, Hyundai,
and less successful ones.
Mitsubishi.
Right. Yeah. And so, you know, it was a very low return, but it wasn't a financial crisis in the sense of this stuff was not going to be evergreen.
It was zombie.
It was zombie-ish, but these were big, fat, slow-moving zombies, and so they weren't going anywhere, but they also weren't catching anybody because they weren't moving. So, I mean, again, it's not to say this isn't an issue from the point of view of Chinese reform or an issue for U.S. and competitors, just to say that we should step back and not view it as, oh my God, they're throwing away money on the stuff that's going to blow up. It's more they're wasting money, just as Japan and Korea did before them.
Interesting. Amy, you know, there's lots of talk about sort of managed economies versus capitalism. And, you know, at the 19th Party Congress, you could see there was a bit of congratulation on China's part. You know, we've had a new model. It might be good for the rest of the world. We're at a very interesting tipping point here. Do you think China's growth model, if it succeeds from a high period of growth to a stable period of growth without having the hard landing that many have predicted for, that's getting on for 10 years now, is that a model that's exportable?
I think China increasingly is trying to promote it as such and is really walking back from the concept that OECD principles need to be applied in the China
That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation
and Development, correct. Okay. And so I do think that China is talking about its different model. And so for many of us China watchers from Washington, D.C., for example, we assumed a convergence of principles that we're clearly not seeing.
That's not happening. What surprised you about the Chinese economy? Because a lot of bears on China have been sort of proved wrong. Well, I mean, the economy never ends watching, but bears who thought there was going to be a collapse haven't seen that.
Right, and the strong role of the state in protecting the domestic economy through the midst of the global financial crisis. China poured a lot of capital into the Chinese economy in order to sustain it. Has turned out to be useful for China. And even over the past years where we saw maybe some more structural side reforms being talked about, they weren't implemented because really allowing greater market forces to dictate economic policy in China bears a risk, and that risk is lack of control. I think that at the Communist Party Congress last October, President Xi really did specifically say we need to address problems, and Yen already noted them: risk, poverty, climate, pollution rather. But I think he was very clearly saying the Chinese model to do so doesn't have to be the model that's been used in other countries. And since then has been saying maybe other countries could look at our model too. Because if we look at the global economy, there are these increasing protectionist voices that aren't necessarily good for the global economy either. China wants to offer a different model for that.
Sitao, what more reforms can you see coming down the pipe that would help growth, and where are the log jams? Last word to you.
What China has pledged after Donald Trump's visit last November, I think could be implemented, meaning a financial service liberalization. Secondly, I do think there is a room for selling off certain state-owned companies' assets, and I think mixed ownership experiment could go a long way. And finally, I do believe resident permit system could be significantly changed, if not in the short term, but in the medium term.
So the reforms continue. It would be very interesting to see if China could continue to grow and prove the naysayers wrong. Thanks so much in Beijing, Portland, Oregon, here in the studio. Really fascinating guests, but that's all we have time for. But the conversation, of course, continues online. Chat with us about this or any of our shows on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Nathan King, Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.